Welcome to another episode of Stories from Science. We've listened to some amazing stories. Last week it was all about blunders in science. We've listened to stories from medicine and even tragic heroes. So today, what is our topic? We are going to be looking at a topic that's very dear to my own heart, and that is women in science. So women in science forms a topic all of its own. It's almost a discipline of study. And that's because of the challenges that women have had that go back 1,000 years. It has not been an equal playing field for men and women when it came to science. So again, today, we shall follow the same pattern as we have in the previous episodes. I will make a statement, and you, my dear audience, think about it. Think if the statement is it false or is it true? And by the end of our episode, see how many you can get right. And those statements will cue us into the story that we are going to look at today. So keep in mind, it's all about women in science, and all of you women and young girls out there who are tuning in and have a passion for science, I hope you enjoy some of the very, very few stories that we shared today. It's just the tip of the iceberg. So I will begin with my first statement, and you try and decide, is it true or false? Here we go. 9% of all Nobel Prizes in science, which means physics, chemistry, and medicine, have gone to women. All right, so is that statement false or is it true? Let me say it for you again. 9% of all the Nobel Prizes in science, which means like in physics, chemistry, and medicine, have gone to women. Is that statement true or false? And the Nobel Prizes are given for the highest achievement and discovery in some of these fields. And they have been being given since 1901, so it's over 100 years old. All right. Well, did you think it was true or false? So let's talk about women in science, and then we will give the answer towards the end. Historically, women have always seemed to be homemakers, domestic servants, and mother. Biologically, giving birth to children relegated them to a private life, and it was seen that all public activities were in the realm of men. And therefore, it was felt that why educate a woman? A woman does not need to be educated to be a homemaker, a maid, or a mother. So things like astronomy and biology and physics and mathematics were not necessary for women. And thus, 50% of the population, right, and all that mental ability was cast aside because they did not even have access to education. If they were at all working, they were hired as caretakers for children, governess, and would be teaching things like French and Spanish in the European countries, things like that. And it was not simply that because women gave birth to children, that was their primary role. It even extended as far as people going to great lengths to show that women's brain sizes were smaller and therefore they were not capable. Yes, you heard me correct. That's the history and the story that we stand upon. Of course, today we know there is no merit to that. A woman is as capable of doing any of the sciences as well as any man can. And to tell you that story, so women didn't have access to education. It was also thought that because of their private roles, there was no need for such. Studies, and there are scholars who said, we were told not to disturb the present system of education, which is the result of the experience and wisdom of the past. And believe it or not, major what's called Ivy League colleges in the United States, like, yes, you know the names, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Columbia. I would love to ask you, when do you think they allowed women entry into these esteemed institutions for education? From about 1969. 1971, 1972. Colombia goes to even 1983. And when you think many of us were around and adults at that time, so imagine in the Western Hemisphere, in the Western world, women did not have access to education. So they had a late head start. Men have had a head start. I have always felt as a woman in science myself that we've been competing with our hands tied behind our back. Things have improved a lot over the many, many years, of course, but there is still the situation of what we call the leaky pipeline. While, especially in the Caribbean, women are pretty well represented, let's say, at the University of the West Indies and the Faculty of Science and Technology. However, as you start to go up the ladder of senior lecturers, professors, and academic positions, the numbers decline tremendously. And that's called the leaky pipeline. Now, if you think about it, the prime time when one does very well and focuses on developing in their career is when? From probably 30 to 40, right? Because you spend your early 20s working and studying to get that PhD. We're talking about academics. And that is the same time where children and home responsibilities take on a key challenge as well. And therefore, many women actually drop out of academia, and that's called the leaky pipeline. So I just wanted to give you that little start with the topic today. So the question of 9% of all Nobel Prizes in science have gone to women. Is it true or false? It's false. And I know you want to hear me say that it's much more than 9%. The sad reality is that it's less than 5%. Less than 5%. There are over 600 awards that have been made, and there are just about 26 women in science that have ever received it. And that tells you that the field has not been equal. And today we strive for not just equality, but equity. Yes, I told you this is a topic dear to my heart as a woman in science, and very, very grateful for the opportunities that I have had. Okay, so let's get started with our actual stories. And I am sure you are thinking, oh, I'm sure she's coming up with Marie Curie, right? Because Marie Curie is perhaps the most famous woman in science, right? She was a physicist. She won 2 Nobel Prizes and was the first woman to ever get a Nobel Prize. Well, guess what? I'm not going to be doing Marie Curie because she's so famous. Let's talk about the stories that are less famous so that you can learn something interesting. All right, so our next statement that you're going to decide if it is true or false, right? Listen carefully. It has to do with the field of mathematics, actually. Einstein, very famous physicist Einstein, said mathematician Emmy Noether from the early 1900s was the most important woman in the history of mathematics. Do you think that statement? Is it true? Is it false? So what's the statement? Einstein said that the mathematician Emmy Noether from the early 1900s was the most important woman in the history of mathematics. So I'm sure you're thinking, oh, who's Emmy Noether? As a lifelong teacher myself, I have a good sense of what people are familiar with and what they are not familiar with, which is why I said we're going to pass on Marie Curie because most people know about her, but hardly anyone has actually heard about Emmy Noether. So who was she? She was a German mathematician who actually contributed tremendous amount in the field of mathematics. Her groundbreaking work is still being used to understand fields in physics. And what's her story? Well, her father was a mathematician, and it's one of the things you're going to see that where there is a woman who has done well in science, there has often been a father, a brother, or a husband who has played a pivotal role. And that in itself tells you that how big the challenges have been. So with her father being a mathematician, she was able to actually sit in on his classes. They even had to get permission to audit, right? Which means just sit in, they could not actually take the courses. in Germany at the time, it actually wasn't so bad. And eventually she was able to get a PhD. And she loved mathematics so much that when she began to teach, they did not want her to be teaching. So they allowed her to teach under the name of her colleague. Yes, of course, her colleague was a very famous male mathematician called Hilbert. And that's not bad enough. She worked for 7 years without any pay. So you can see how demoralizing it would have been for other women who perhaps love the field and realize I'm going to spend all that energy and time and I can't even earn a penny. It turned out that not only, is she a woman, she was also a Jew, and you may have heard me say that she was German. Well, put those three things together, and when Hitler rises to power in 1933, thereabouts, it was a common story, not just for women, and we will do a special episode on the war, but for any Jewish scientists really underwent a lot of, they had to actually flee their country. Their labs were burned down, they lost their jobs, and in a similar fashion, Emmy Noether had to flee and leave Germany. So she ended up going to the United States, and where she actually worked in the universities and at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies for the rest of her life. So she did pretty well. Now, she died at what we'll say is a young age of 53 from complications from an operation for ovarian cyst. And why do I mention that? Because these are some of the issues that I want to bring home to you. Men and women, yes, are biologically different, not that their brain power is different, but in other aspects that they are different, and women have a lot of biological challenges, right? No man would have ever died of complications from operation on an ovarian cyst. So we lost an absolutely brilliant mind at a fairly young age of 53. So was that statement true or false? So I'll remind you if you've forgotten. Einstein said that the mathematician Emmy Noether from the early 1900s was the most important woman in the history of mathematics. And that, my friends, is actually true. So that's the esteem in which scientists like Albert Einstein held her, and they used her mathematics. Now, isn't it interesting that you know Albert Einstein? Well, who doesn't know him? But I am quite sure that almost everybody who's watching this has hardly heard of Emmy Noether unless you are in the field of mathematics. So we've kicked off our episode today on women in science by looking at very briefly actually, some of the challenges that women have had historically. And we've met our first woman of science mathematician, Emmy Noether. So folks, let's take a break at this point, and I'll be right back, and we will look at some other stories of women in science. Welcome back, folks. And the topic we are discussing today is women in science. And women in science have had a hard time. It has barely been, I will say it's barely been 100 years. It has not even been 100 years, decades, as we've seen in the previous half, that they've actually even had access to education. There's an entire field, there are things that we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, and there are huge amounts of effort to encourage our girls to get into these fields. The numbers are worldwide, less than or just about 30% of women are actually working in STEM fields. Okay, so let's get to our next story. And here's my statement that you are going to try and decide if it is true or false. Here we go. Harvard computers refer to the powerful server machines used for astronomy. What could that have to do with women in science? Let's go. Harvard computers refer to the powerful server machines used for astronomy. Is that false? Is it true? Which one do you think? So you're asking, okay, what are Harvard computers? We all know what computers are. I'm sitting with one right here. But did you know that in the early 1900s, computers, long before the advent of computers, were women who computed, and they were actually called computers, right? And so what were Harvard computers? Okay, so now you're trying to see, right, if our statement was true or false, which I will give definitely at the end of the story. So who were these women? So it so happens that in the early 1900s, they had telescopes and a lot of data was coming in and not enough people to process it. And one such scientist, astronomer, his name was Pickering, and he was working at an observatory. And his assistant was really doing sloppy work. Yes, a gentleman was doing very sloppy work. And he was so frustrated that, you know what he said? He said, he put his hands up in the air, he did fire him. And he said, even my maid could do a better job. And guess what he did? Yes, he hired his maid. Because she, actually, before she was a maid, she had worked as a teacher. And she knew she had some level of education. And her name was Wilhelmina Fleming. And Wilhelmina Fleming was the first of the Harvard computers. And it's a sort of a sad twist that it turns out that Pickering realized that it was much cheaper to hire women. So he can have a much larger workforce than if he hired men. And they came to be known as Pickering's harem. This is true science, history of science, right? And at one time, there were like over 80 women that were working on just looking at the data, the plates with all the images of the stars coming in, classifying it, recording it, and they were doing a fantastic job. And we are sharing images in these episodes, and you will see the Harvard computers. And at times, they were offering work to these women were doing it not just for the less than just about factory pay, but for free, so that they could simply have some experience and an opportunity to do something that was so difficult to get into. And that has been the story of our women in science. So was that true or false, that Harvard computers refer to the powerful server machines used for astronomy? Of course, you know the answer. That is very much false, because Harvard computers are a group of women who worked tediously, meticulously on astronomy data that was coming in. So there are all kinds of fascinating stories that are about women in science. It takes a lot of energy for me to just pick a few that I share with you today. And I shall now move to my next story. And as we've done before, I'm going to give you the statement. Lise Meitner received the Nobel Prize in Physics for discovering fission. Okay, and I'll explain what we're talking about. So is that statement false or is it true? Lise Meitner, so that's a lady's name. And again, I shall take a chance and say that very few people may have heard of her. I am well aware, like I said, being a teacher, the persons that people are familiar with, for example, Albert Einstein. So Lise Meitner received the Nobel Prize in Physics for discovering fission. What's the story there? Lise Meitner was a brilliant woman, a brilliant physicist, the first professor of physics in Germany. And that's where you were having a lot of tremendous development in science in that era. And the era that we are dealing with her is, again, the early 1920s and 1930s. And it turns out Lise Meitner, like our other story earlier, was a Jewish woman. So it's bad enough if you're a woman in science, and it's really bad if you happen to be Jew, and it all gets really, really difficult if you are in Germany. So she had to flee. So you had scientists abroad that were really working on helping these brilliant scientists escape when Hitler started to rise to power in Germany. And they fired her, their lab notes and things are destroyed, and they leave the country with nothing. She left with nothing but I think one ring undercover that she had from her mother. And she went to Sweden and established herself. Now, she was doing really well when she was in Germany, and she had colleagues there. And one of her colleagues was Otto Hahn. And Otto Hahn, she was continuing to collaborate with him while she's now out of Germany by way of letters. And she had co-discovered some elements, and they were working with radiation and things like that. And her colleague was trying to understand how uranium was behaving, right? A certain element, and they couldn't understand. And she figured it out. And she wrote to him and said, I believe, right, with her nephew, she did some work, this is what's going on, that the nucleus is actually splitting, and she worked out how much energy it would give off. So folks, some of you who may be having a little background in physics, she is also known as the mother of the atom bomb. And you have likely never heard of Lise Meitner. And her colleagues, they needed to distance themselves from her. They actually said, Otto Hahn said, you have to understand, as was reported, that he really couldn't mention Meitner because he couldn't be seen to be working with a Jew. So he totally denied her contributions, and this is where it gets painful, right? He went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics, and she didn't. He won it in chemistry. She was actually at the same time nominated for it in physics, and she did not. Not only did she not win it that time, but she did not win the Nobel Prize in physics, that was her area, a staggering 49 times. 49 times Lise Meitner was nominated for the Nobel Prize and never received it. And it is only now in this era that we are starting to understand the disservice that has happened to brilliant women that made brilliant contributions. And Einstein, who was a contemporary at all these times, he used to call her our Marie Curie. And he nominated her at some point as well. Well, it has a slight nice ending that more than 2 decades later, when she did all of this work, she did receive what's a very major prize, not the Nobel Prize, the Enrico Fermi Prize for their discovery along with her colleagues. And do you know she never harbored ill will to Otto Hahn and how they totally discarded her and distanced themselves from her for the work that she did? How's that for a remarkable woman? So, the statement, Lise Meitner received the Nobel Prize in Physics for discovering fission, as you can tell by my story, it turns out to be false. She never did. She should have, but she never did. And there are many, many stories like this. In a previous episode, we covered stolen science, in which Rosalind Franklin's work, her contribution, was not recognized in what she did in the discovery of the pattern of the DNA. Okay. All right, so we've covered, and there's always a very sad element when you look at the stories of women in science. The next story touches my heart to no end, and I shall begin with a statement once again. Here's the statement. No Indian woman has ever gone into space. No Indian woman has ever gone into space. Is this false? Is this true? Okay, so what story is connected with Indian woman going into space or not going into space? Folks, meet Kalpana Chawla. Kalpana Chawla is from the region of Punjab in India, born in 1962. And she was not your regular little girl. She dreamed of being an astronaut. And I saw an interview with her where she said she had no idea if her family would even allow her to study engineering. And it turns out that she was the first woman to enroll in aeronautical engineering at the Punjab Engineering College. Brilliant, brilliant girl. From there, she moved to the United States, where she did her master's and her PhD with NASA and started working with NASA. And she was a certified flight instructor. She had the rating for airplanes, gliders, and commercial pilot licenses for single and multi-engine airplanes, seaplanes, and gliders. She went on 2 space shuttle missions, and we could therefore say, right, you're getting your answer there, right? So this one is, the answer has been built into the story. She managed to complete 30 days in space over 2 space shuttle missions. Meet Kalpana Chawla. And of course, from her picture, you can tell that she was working as an astronaut. So the statement, no Indian woman has ever gone into space, is absolutely false, because Kalpana Chawla, born in India, grew up in India, did go on 2 space shuttle missions. And it's there the story turns truly tragic. And some of you who are older may remember that on the 1st of February 2003, I always remember because suddenly I was in a store and there was the radio on and there was a news about the space shuttle blowing up and all 7 crew members dying. As I say this, I'm feeling a chill down my spine. Kalpana Chawla was on that mission. And at the tender age of 40, she lost her life. And just imagine how much she had to contribute. But she continues to contribute by being such an inspiration to all of us, to all the young women and all the girls who think that I can't do this, this is not for me, and need that mentorship. She has been honored in many, many ways. They have named a spacecraft after her. There's an asteroid, a lunar crater, and a hill on Mars in her honor. And posthumously, after she died, she was actually awarded in the US the Congressional Space Medal of Honor, the NASA Space Flight Medal, and the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. A life cut too short, an absolutely inspiring, brilliant young lady. So here you've heard the stories of some of the women who inspire us. All right, so today we have touched a very, very important topic of women in science. And the battle is not over. We still, me as a woman in science, speak to you and say we still have ways to go. We've made a lot of the journey, yet the numbers are still smaller. The women generally earn less. They are generally not at the top of the field. They do not get tenure as much as men in comparable fields as them. And therefore, for all of you with young girls as family members and anyone watching this, it's really important to know that you are brilliant and you have so much to contribute. Just like Kalpana Chawla thought that I can't be an astronaut, but she could be. So folks, we're going to wrap up today with these stories that we've looked at about women in science, and they're always stories of inspiration with elements of tragedy, but somewhere we stand on the shoulders of these women and make it their worthwhile, all that they did, so that we could do what we are doing now. So folks, it's a wrap for today. Until I see you next time for another episode of Stories from Science. Bye-bye.